left click forward, right at the back. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And thank you very much to Matthew as well, who's set up what I want to say very nicely. What I want to talk about today is the role of Julian Corbett, a name with which you may all be familiar, and if you're not, you will soon be familiar. Corbett is not just a writer of books that you need to read. He is also a critical component in British planning for and conduct of and recording of the First World War. Born in 1854, the son of a very prosperous property developer, Corbett was quite clearly a brilliant young man. He starred at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he secured a first-class law degree. He practiced at the bar for some period, and then in the 1880s, after the death of his father, he retired from the bar, which he found rather boring, and took up a career managing the family estate and writing novels. His novels were clever, but not as engaging, perhaps, as they might have been. After doing many other things, including beginning to write naval history, he started teaching on the Senior Officers' War Course of the Royal Navy in 1902, a course set up on the initiative of one J. Fisher, Esquire, later Lord Fisher. Between 1902 and 1914, Corbett became the lead lecturer on this course, teaching strategy and history. He was not a historian for the sake of the past, and he was not a strategist for the sake of theory. Corbett's principal output, his book Some Principles of Maritime Strategy of 1911, a foundational text in the genre, is contemporary British strategic doctrine. It is not a reflection on the nature of maritime strategy, general, or indeed on maritime history. It is what he and the Royal Navy's leadership thought at the time was British strategy. It was signed off by the First Sea Lord and the new Chief of the Admiralty Staff. This was how Britain thought about waging war going into the First World War. Limited warfare, command of the sea, economic warfare, the insertion of the army as an amphibious element in the procurement of ever-increasing maritime dominance, leading to the destruction of the enemy's economy. And it certainly did not involve the assembly of a mass army and the waging of large-scale battles to liberate Central European territories from invading Germans. When the war broke out, however, as is often the case, things did not go according to plan. The point of all of this you need to be aware of is actually not the North Sea, but right down here. Antwerp, Zeebrugge and Ostend, and we'll come to the second section. When the war broke out, it was eventually decided by the government, on the advice of the War Office, that the British Expeditionary Force, a very small force, it has to be said, around 100,000 men, should be sent to join the French fighting line in France. The Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, General Sir John French, former midshipman Royal Navy, who suffered severely from seasickness and thus joined the other lot, advised that this was the wrong place and that the army should be sent to Antwerp. Belgium had been invaded, and the whole point of Britain going to war was not to protect France. The French had plenty of soldiers, lots of forts, and a real good reason for defending their own country. It was to keep the bad guys out of Belgium. Never forget, the British created Belgium to stop the bad guys getting up onto the Channel and having a base from which to invade. For the last 600 years, all the major invasions of England have come from Belgium. And if you listen to Boris, obviously it's still happening now. But that's another question. What had happened was that in their despair, their sense of personal grievance, the British cabinet, who knew absolutely nothing about war, it has to be said, the British hadn't fought a serious war for a long time, and most of those in the cabinet hadn't even thought about fighting a war. They were so upset by how badly the Germans had behaved, they decided to just get on with it, and they took the advice of the first senior military person who banged on the door. That happened to be Henry Wilson, who'd planned for the British Army to join the French, rather than do what the British Army normally did, which was to join the Royal Navy in what's Corbett identified as a combined arms strategy. Britain was only powerful if the Army and the Navy worked seamlessly together to secure and enhance command of the sea. It was not the job of the British Army to take on and defeat the Germans somewhere in Central Europe. This decision was no sooner taken than Corbett realised it was a terrible mistake, and he would be involved in attempts to reverse that mistake, and later in recording and analysing what the consequences of that catastrophic error were. You've all been in a country church, you've all seen the name board. That is the consequence of faulty strategy. Today I want to concentrate on the period leading up to the Battle of Jutland and to look at what Corbett and others were doing to try and win the war without waging mass continental suicide. In mid-October 1914, Corbett left his post for minor surgery, and he returned in late November to find that Fisher, Lord Fisher, had returned as First Sea Lord to replace the lacklustre German Battenberg. Furthermore, the battle fleet balance in naval power had shifted, and Britain was now, it's Mr. Churchill, Fisher, here's the world in communication terms. The red lines are cable telegraphs and the black circles are wireless ranges. And this, of course, is a German chart because the Germans are obsessed with British global communications. And this is how the British clear the outer seas of enemy vessels. As we have some Australians here, I thought we'd better have an Australian on the screen. Fisher was recalled because Battenberg spent most of his day at the Admiralty during the war doing the Times crossword. This was far more challenging than fighting the enemy. Despite the opposition of the King, who really didn't like Fisher, and most of the senior admirals, who also really didn't like Fisher, he was brought back in to do a very important job, which was to galvanise the war and impose some strategic logic on the maritime campaign. The thing you need to remember is that for many years, Corbett and Fisher had been working together. Fisher's ideas about global maritime strategy were those of Sir Julian Corbett. Fisher's favourite book was Corbett's 1907 text, England in the 7 Years' War, A Study in Combined Strategy, and passages in that book would be quoted by Fisher throughout the rest of his life. He always referred to Corbett and this book in particular as the key to everything. In 1907, Corbett had written, in the long series of wars between France and England, you can cross out France and obviously write in Germany, the most telling move of the enemy has always been to concentrate her operations against the Netherlands in order to get possession of them and so increase at once her own industrial wealth and destroy the security of the English naval position. The Low Countries are the key to British strategy, not France. If we have the Low Countries secure, we are in a good position. But if the enemy has cruiser bases on the Belgian coast, we are in trouble. And with the invention of the submarine, we are in a lot more trouble than when they were populated by French privateers. This is a serious problem. Corbett emphasised the strategic threat by observing that even Frederick the Great, a high strategic authority, had advised the French to seize the Netherlands in order to strike at Britain. If you want to attack Britain, this is the way to go. All successful invasions of Britain come from the Netherlands, not from France. Well, apart from that 1066 stuff, but that is ancient history. British diplomacy had as its main job, Corbett said, to confine the threatening war to the theatres beyond the sea where lay our special object and our peculiar strength. Our controlling aim was to ensure that we should not be drawn into a European struggle and forced to fight for our ends where our power was weakest. Britain is a weak continental military power. It has a small army. It does not have millions. It has 100,000. To purchase an alliance at the price of sending a serious military force into the very cockpit of Europe was to ensure the consequences which it was the sole object of the alliance to prevent. Moreover, it was to offer a price which the instinct of the country had determined not to pay. Strategic lesson of Fisher's favourite book was that Britain commanded the sea and waged economic maritime war. It did not wage war by using a mass army. The army, as Fisher famously said, was a projectile to be fired by the Navy. What he didn't say was the target of that projectile was the enemy's naval bases and enemy naval strategic positions. Coming into office, Fisher's strategy was founded on pre-war Admiralty planning. That strategy had always hinged on controlling the Baltic Sea, as well as the North Sea. Okay. Fisher decided that the key to the war would be, and he and Corbett developed this plan together, would be to bring the British Expeditionary Force out of the French fighting line, use it in combination with new specially built naval assets to clear the Belgian coast right up to the Dutch frontier, thereby closing the Germans into this very small North Sea area, which could be controlled by patrols, submarines and observational minefields. The minefields were just to give a warning of German exits from harbour. They were not there to stop the Germans leaving. The minefields were of course replaced by signals intelligence, which gave away all of the German movements anyway. To exploit sea power inshore, Fisher did not propose to use the expensive fleet of dreadnoughts that Matthew has just been talking about. He proposed to build a new fleet, a siege fleet of specialist vessels, monitors, landing craft, minesweepers and other coastal vessels to project power in home waters against the enemy. On December 14th, 1914, Corbett delivered to Fisher a strategic memorandum which the two of them had worked out together, setting out the entire strategy as they envisaged it. Essentially, Britain would clear the outer seas of enemy vessels. This task was almost complete by the end of 1914. It would then get a grip on the North Sea, pinning the Germans into this position, and it would then strike for a decision by seizing control of the Baltic and cutting off Germany from its last remaining source of overseas supply of critical strategic raw materials. Germany now depended on importing iron, steel products, copper and food from Sweden. Without those resources, Germany's war industries would collapse. Germany had lost access to all other external sources of iron ore and did not produce enough to sustain our own war industries. The position with copper was even worse. If you imagine fighting the First World War without steel and copper, you begin to get a sense of where Germany was. The food problem was even worse because the Germans had mobilized all of their agricultural workmen into the army and were killing them very quickly. They were not going to be growing anywhere near as much food with the war newly broken out, and they would very much like to import food from abroad. The British blockade was going to stop them doing that. Fisher had pointed out the importance of the offensive, and he and Corbett agreed that any such plan would require careful development. They did not plan in their Baltic scheme to use the Grand Fleet in the Baltic. They did not plan to send it anywhere near the Baltic. The purpose of attacking towards the Baltic was to draw out the German fleet and destroy it, or to seize control of the Baltic. It was certainly not to use the Grand Fleet within the Baltic. Fisher estimated it would take 12 months to build this fleet for Baltic operations. It would take 6 months to build a fleet for the operations on the Belgian coast. This would enable them to be conducted in the summer of 1915 and the Baltic operation in the spring of 1916. And this does tie in with Jutland. The key to this argument was Fisher's and Corbett's belief that it was likely that the limitations on the blockade imposed by the Foreign Office, based on the unratified Declaration of London, may render it difficult to reach a decision through economic warfare alone. The blockade may not be the killing tool that people had anticipated. It's often said that Fisher's paper was his own work. It certainly wasn't. The only line in it that was his was the last one, where he pointed out that as currently deployed, the British Expeditionary Force was about as much use to Britain as if it was deployed to Timbuktu. This was classic Fisher, and like Corbett, he believed that only the operation of the two services jointly would secure a strategic result. The problem for Fisher was that Churchill was not prepared to wait on a long-term plan that would take 12 to 18 months to complete. Churchill was under severe political pressure and was desperate to get something done now. As a result, he picked up and ran with the Dardanelles project, which began as a naval attack backed by the Greek army, then became a purely naval offensive, and then morphed slowly into other things. None of these were core British strategy. There's a battle cruiser at the Battle of Heligoland Bight. Old battleships were used on the Belgian coast to stop the advance of the German army. This was the flagship HMS Venerable, and they'd be backed up by other vessels that Fisher was building. This is from Fisher's archive, and I think this is really the basis of what I want to talk about. This is the whole of the German coast in the North Sea. The inference of that is we've cleared the Germans off the Belgian coast. We've confined them to this very useless piece of strategic territory from which it's difficult to operate. This is the route the Germans used to leave the Baltic. This is a new line of defence the Danes are building outside Copenhagen, like the lines of Torres Vedras. If you know that Wellington's operations in the peninsula were not designed to kick the French out of Spain, they were designed to stop them getting hold of Lisbon, which is a first-class naval base. If the French can be kept out of Lisbon, Wellington is doing his job. The lines of Torres Vedras are a classic piece of British strategy, using the army to deny the enemy a naval base. These lines were actually put up shortly after Fisher left office. Fisher was clearly working on this. It may explain why he wished to return to office after May 1915. Fisher's plan has often been derided. It's often been thought of as half-baked. It's been dismissed as impractical, that the Grand Fleet couldn't get into the Baltic. It was never going. There was never any intention. The headline items in Fisher's plan for the Baltic were 3 high-speed, light-draft, fast battle cruisers of the Courageous class. They were designed very specifically to steam through the Sound on the Swedish side with a maximum draft of 23 feet. The man who designed them says that was the only part of the design brief that was critical. They were designed for one mission and one mission only. Whether Fisher even intended to deploy them is significant. As Matthew has told you, Fisher was a master of playing the game of outthinking the enemy. Fisher's great genius was to persuade the other guys to do what he wanted them to do, not to defeat them front on. Fisher is not a great enthusiast for battle. His first serious battle was a major repulse in the Second China War, where he saw many men killed and ships sunk. He did not think fighting was a good idea. He thought persuading the enemy to do your bidding without fighting was really clever. One of Fisher's great strokes in the naval arms race was in 1907, on the anniversary of the British capture and destruction of the Danish Navy at Copenhagen. He said, with the express permission of the King, Edward VII, that it might be wise to Copenhagen the German Navy. Copenhagen and the Baltic had been at the centre of his thinking about strategy since the late 1890s. As soon as the enemy is Germany, the Baltic is critical. The Baltic had always been critical because before Germany, the enemy was Russia. And the capital of Russia is on the Baltic Sea. So controlling the Baltic and accessing the Baltic is priceless. The Danes had been pressured by the Germans into laying minefields in the Great Belt, main navigational channel, to stop the British coming through, and also some in the Sound. But the Swedes, given their economic importance to the Germans, could not be bullied into laying minefields. They refused. In fact, they allowed British merchant ships to leave the Baltic through Swedish territorial waters. They were playing both sides, which was diplomatically quite astute. So, what is Fisher thinking? Fisher's thinking is quite clear. Once the coast of Belgium has been cleared and the serious danger to British shipping, particularly the shipping supporting the army operating in France, has been cleared away, the Germans can be pressed back into this southeastern section of the North Sea, and then when the new fleet is ready, it will be moved into the Kattegat, down towards Copenhagen, to threaten German command of the Baltic. British are already operating submarines in the Baltic which are sinking ships carrying iron and other products to Germany. Reinforcing that with a surface squadron able to operate from Russian bases. Remember, Russia is our ally. They have advanced naval bases in the eastern Baltic. And the surface ships that were being sent in were faster than any surface ships the Germans had. They were more powerfully armed than any the Germans had, and they had a very long endurance. Given you're trying to keep your displacement down, why would you fit ships with a long endurance fuel supply if you weren't envisaging a particular kind of operation? The Germans know about this. The Germans are aware what the British are doing, and they are responding to it, and they're beginning to plan for the operation Fisher really wishes them to conduct. which is the invasion and conquest of Denmark. At this point, when Germany invades Denmark, Germany's relationship with the rest of Scandinavia collapses. Scandinavians will not look kindly on a German invasion of Denmark. This will bring the Scandinavian powers over into the Entente camp. It will greatly increase the ability of Britain to blockade Germany. And the British Expeditionary Force, which is finished in its Belgian duties, will be deployed to the island of Zeeland. Just as the British Army was deployed in 1807, it will hold open the Sound and enable the British to operate in the Baltic, taking control of those seas away from the Germans. Germany's war effort at this point collapses. Whether the Germans send their fleet out to fight, which is highly likely, there is one thing you can be sure of. If the Germans choose to fight a naval battle over control of the Baltic, they will not run away. This will be a mission that they have to complete. They will have to fight this to the finish. This is the battle that Fisher is holding back the Grand Fleet for. When the Germans have to come out because their major strategic assets are being threatened, you will then get a naval battle where the enemy doesn't run away. And the parallel here, well, the parallel, let's go back to the 7 Years' War, is the campaign of 1759. I know it's ancient history, but it's highly relevant. In 1759, the British Army, landed by the Navy, captures Quebec. The fall of Canada, French Canada, into British hands is established. The French, in an attempt to recover their lost overseas empire in Canada, the West Indies and India, decide to launch a full-scale invasion of Britain. They bring their main battle fleet together. Well, they fail actually because it's intercepted and part of it destroyed. They assemble an invasion force in Brittany and they begin to mass their squadrons on the southern coast of Brittany. As those squadrons are moving, the British intercept their main battle fleet in Quiberon Bay and destroy it. The French have lost the war. They've lost their navy, they've lost their colonies, they've lost the ability to defend their shipping, their economy will collapse and they will be left bankrupt and defeated. This is the war that Fisher wishes to fight, and this is the equivalent of Quebec. This is what the British Army is meant to do in the First World War. It's meant to open up the possibility of imposing a complete blockade on Imperial Germany. This way we avoid sending millions of men to fight in France to defend somebody else's country, and we just might win the war in a more intelligent and sophisticated way. And it was to protect the assets that he was constructing for this mission that Fisher resigned from office in May 1915. Churchill's obsession with winning the Dardanelles was draining away all of the resources that Fisher was building for this mission. Fisher, I'm convinced, was determined to see this through, and this was the reason he wished to come back into office. When Corbett came to write the official history of the First World War, which he was commissioned to do around the time Fisher left office, the story of the war in the 3 volumes that he completed before his untimely death was simply this: clearing the outer seas, gripping the North Sea, preparing for the Baltic. And Corbett's job in the official history of the First World War was to rescue British maritime strategy from the Western Front and the catastrophe at Gallipoli. The problem with Gallipoli was that it suggested that combined operations were not a good idea. This had to be rebutted. Corbett's other job was to demonstrate that not winning the Battle of Jutland in a decisive fashion wasn't important. Not losing it was critical. Corbett made the comparison clear and overt. He says, what did we get out of Trafalgar that we did not get out of Jutland? And the answer to it is very little. A morale-boosting tactical victory perhaps, but otherwise very little. Command of the sea before and after the battle. So when he writes the war up, Corbett is writing the war that Fisher wished to fight, the war that he had identified before the war, and explaining why it didn't happen. As a slightly more detailed version of the Baltic entrances, these have been a focal point of British strategy since at least the days of Cromwell. Getting a fleet in through those waters has been critical. And if you want to know what Fisher's funny-looking ships look like, there's Marshal Ney. Probably the only thing we should have done to tip our hats to the French. 2 15-inch guns and some not very reliable diesel engines. They ended up bombarding the coast of Belgium. When the war ended, Corbett made a brilliant tactical move. He allowed Fisher to take the memorandum that he had written, his steady pressure memorandum, and publish it in Fisher's otherwise quite racy memoirs. This allowed Corbett to get those ideas out there in the public domain and build his argument around him. Tragically, he died, having finished the Battle of Jutland, but no more. If you read the official history of the war in 5 volumes, you'll find Corbett wrote the first 3, and they are a serious investigation of British strategy on the ground level. Unlike the Army and Air Force histories, which are operational and tactical, the strategic narrative is in the official Naval Operations volume. After Corbett's death, the concept, the strategy disappears, and we're left with a pretty mundane run-through of stuff that happens, which is tragic. But what Corbett was intending to do is quite clear. He was reproducing the 7 Years' War and explaining why it didn't work so well this time around. This was precisely what he was commissioned to do. When he was commissioned to write the official history, that was the model that he was operating on. It was a model that he'd already used for another official history, that of the Russo-Japanese War, which he finished at the outbreak of the First World War. The synergy between Corbett and Fisher is of the one senior officer who had a big idea which was worth trying other than the Western Front, and the one man who had the intellectual ability to pull all of this together in a pattern. Consequently, in May 1916, when Reinhard Scheer is thinking about coming out to sea and trying to cut off part of the British fleet, what's John Jellicoe doing? Well, John Jellicoe is thinking, I finally get all that stuff Fisher's been talking about, the Baltic. Fisher is bombarding Jellicoe with this material all the way through his time as First Sea Lord. Finally, Jellicoe, penny drops, and he goes, right, my next sortie, the sortie that was aborted by Scheer coming out, I'm going to send a powerful cruiser squadron with battle cruiser support down into Danish waters within visual range of Copenhagen. Finally, the penny has dropped. Jellicoe now knows what the whole of the war in the North Sea is about. It's about putting the Germans in a position where they must fight, not looking for them to see if they will fight, putting them in a position to make sure they will fight. The tragedy is, of course, that this is an operation which is entirely naval. Had the threat been of an amphibious landing in Denmark, then the Germans would have come out with a very different set of agendas. Not to try and cut off an ambush part of the Grand Fleet and scuttle away as quick as possible, but to stand and fight to defend their vital interests. The Baltic is absolutely central to the way the Germans think. As you probably know, the Germans invaded Denmark in 1940, but the plan they used was written in 1916. The Germans have been obsessed about the security of their northern flank and the possibility of a British amphibious landing and of British naval control of the Baltic Sea. Where did Fisher pick this up? He picked it up from the Germans at the First Hague Peace Conference in 1899. But if you read the German documents, it's quite clear the Germans are petrified about control of the Baltic. The North Sea is not important, the Baltic is. So on the eve of Jutland, we're in a position where the two fleets are coming out with different strategic agendas. But the British mission is aborted by Scheer's sortie. Scheer's sortie, in fact, stops the British doing something they should have done rather sooner, which is to see just how serious the Germans are about control of the Baltic. We know that they were quite serious because early in 1915, British submarine E-13 ran aground just off Copenhagen, and while the Danes were taking the crew off and interning the submarine, a German destroyer flotilla steamed into Danish territorial waters and opened fire, killing Danish and British sailors. They apologized for it, but only just. The Germans were not prepared to think rationally about control of the Baltic, and this is what Fisher is playing on. In the same way that he's playing on those expectations of the arms race, he's playing on their expectations about the Baltic. So while it's a what if, it's a very important what if because it is what the British were planning before the First World War, and it is what Jellicoe was planning on the eve of Jutland. Thank you very much. you.